The contract was supposed to be simple. 50 days, no emotions, clean exit. But when she whispered, "I do," with tears in her eyes and a secret in her trembling hands, Alexander Chen realized he'd just signed away more than money. "Thanks so much for being here, my amazing story family. If you're excited for today's adventure and ready to dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and share in the comments where you're tuning in from. And don't forget, another captivating story awaits you tomorrow. You definitely won't want to miss it." The 34th floor of the Chen Tower hummed with the efficiency of a machine built for one purpose: generating wealth. Alexander stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection sharp against the Seattle skyline. At 32, he'd mastered the art of transaction. Every relationship measured in profit margins, every conversation calculated for maximum return. The Armani suit fit like armor, and the Patek Philippe on his wrist ticked away seconds he'd learned to monetize. "Sir." His assistant Marcus knocked softly. "The car is ready." Alexander didn't turn. Below, people moved like ants through Pioneer Square, their lives small and manageable from this height. "Have the papers been finalized?" "Yes, sir. 50 days as requested. All contingencies covered." 50 days. Enough time to satisfy the board's archaic requirement that he be married to inherit his grandfather's trust. Enough time to prove that love was just another commodity, purchased, utilized, and discarded when no longer needed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Chen Industries had been built on his grandfather's belief in family values. Yet here Alexander stood, about to enter a marriage as cold as the contracts that made him rich. But emotions were liabilities, and Alexander Chen had learned to liquidate liabilities long ago. What do you think drives someone to view marriage as just another business transaction? Share your thoughts below. His phone buzzed. A text from his lawyer. "She's arrived at the venue. Everything's on schedule." Alexander straightened his tie and walked toward a destiny he believed he could control. Across the city, Isabella Romano sat in the back of a taxi, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The vintage locket at her throat felt heavier than its silver weight, carrying secrets that could destroy everything. "You okay back there, miss?" The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "You look a little pale." Isabella forced a smile. Wedding nerves. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but not from typical bridal jitters. The dress, borrowed from a friend who thought this was a fairy tale romance, felt like a costume for a role she'd never auditioned for. The contract in her purse might as well have been a script for a performance that would determine everything. The taxi pulled up to the exclusive hotel where Seattle's elite conducted their most private affairs. Through tinted glass, Isabella could see photographers being turned away by security. At least Alexander Chen valued discretion. She'd Googled him obsessively for weeks. Tech mogul, philanthropist, Forbes 30 under 33 years running. What the articles didn't mention was why a man who could have anyone would choose a contract marriage with a woman he'd met exactly once. But Isabella knew why she'd said yes, and the reason made her stomach clench with guilt and desperate hope in equal measure. "That'll be $18.50, the driver said. Isabella handed him a 20, nearly the last of her cash, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The hotel's marble facade rose above her like a monument to everything she'd never been part of. Valets in crisp uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, and she caught glimpses of crystal chandeliers through revolving doors. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed. "Na," she whispered when the weak voice answered. "I'm here. I'm about to. We're going to be okay. I promise." The voice on the other end was barely audible, ravaged by months of illness, but the love in it was unmistakable. "My brave girl. Are you sure about this?" Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the locket's weight against her heart. "I have to be." She ended the call and walked through the revolving door into a world that glittered with the kind of wealth that could solve every problem, except the ones that mattered most. The wedding coordinator, a sharp woman in Chanel, appeared at her elbow. "Ms. Romano, we're ready for you." Isabella nodded and let herself be guided toward the elevator that would take her to Alexander Chen and a marriage built on everything except love. As the elevator climbed, she pressed her hand to the locket one more time, whispering a prayer to the photo inside, a prayer that 50 days would be enough time to save the only family she had left, even if it cost her everything else. The chapel was intimate by billionaire standards. Only 20 guests, mostly Alexander's board members and a handful of Isabella's carefully selected friends who believed this was a whirlwind romance. Soft piano music drifted through air perfumed with white orchids, each bloom costing more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Alexander stood at the altar, his posture perfect, hands clasped behind his back in a stance that had intimidated competitors across boardroom tables. But as the doors opened and Isabella appeared, something shifted in his chest, a flutter he hadn't felt since he was 12 years old, watching his mother pack her bags. She moved down the aisle like she was walking through water, each step deliberate but uncertain. The dress was simple, ivory silk that caught the light without demanding attention, but it was her face that stopped his breath. Where he'd expected the polished composure of someone entering a business arrangement, he saw something raw and real. Her dark eyes held shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices. Their gazes met halfway down the aisle, and Isabella stumbled slightly. A genuine smile, the first he'd worn in months, tugged at Alexander's lips. Without thinking, he stepped forward, extending his hand earlier than tradition demanded. "I've got you," he murmured as she reached him. Isabella's fingers were ice cold in his warm grip, and he felt her pulse racing against his palm. "Thank you," she whispered, and something in her voice made his chest tighten. The officiant, a discreet judge who'd married half of Seattle's power couples, began the ceremony with practiced efficiency. But as the familiar words washed over them, both Alexander and Isabella found themselves caught in a moment that felt anything but transactional. "The couple has written their own vows," the judge announced. Alexander reached into his jacket for the card his assistant had prepared. Legal language dressed up as romance, carefully crafted to mean nothing. But as he looked into Isabella's eyes, the words died in his throat. "Isabella," he began, abandoning the script entirely. We both know why we're here. This isn't a fairy tale. But standing here now, I find myself wondering if we might find something real in the midst of all this pretense." Isabella's breath caught. This wasn't part of their arrangement. The contract had been clear. No emotional investment, no complications. But something in his voice, a vulnerability she hadn't expected from the cold businessman who'd negotiated their terms, made her own carefully rehearsed words crumble. Her hand moved unconsciously to the locket at her throat. "Alexander, I wish I could promise you honesty. I wish I could stand here and tell you everything about who I am and why I'm here. But what I can promise is that these 50 days, they'll matter to me. You'll matter to me." The words hung in the air like a confession neither had planned to make. Alexander felt something crack in the walls he'd spent years building, while Isabella realized she'd just spoken the most dangerous truth of her life. "Do you, Alexander Chen, take Isabella Romano to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Alexander's thumb traced across Isabella's knuckles, a gesture so gentle it seemed to surprise them both. "I do. Do you, Isabella Romano, take Alexander Chen to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Isabella's voice broke slightly as she whispered, "I do. You may kiss the bride." This was the moment Alexander had dreaded, the performance of intimacy with a stranger. But as he stepped closer, Isabella's free hand rose to rest against his chest, right over his heart. The gesture was so trusting, so unconsciously intimate, that everything else faded away. Their first kiss was supposed to be for show, a brief press of lips to satisfy the audience. Instead, it became something neither expected. Soft, questioning, real. Isabella's eyes fluttered closed, and Alexander found himself cupping her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing across her cheek. When they broke apart, both were breathing unevenly. The applause around them sounded distant, muffled by the thundering of their hearts. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Chen." As they walked back down the aisle, Alexander's hand firm at the small of Isabella's back, she felt the locket shift against her skin. Guilt twisted in her stomach like a knife. He'd been kind, unexpectedly gentle, and she was lying to him with every breath. At the chapel doors, Alexander leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Are you okay? You're shaking." Isabella looked up at him, this man who was now legally her husband, and saw genuine concern in his eyes. It would have been so much easier if he'd remained the cold businessman from their initial meeting. "I'm fine," she lied, even as her hand moved to steady the locket. "Just taking it all in." Alexander studied her face, those sharp gray eyes missing nothing. "There's something." "Mr. Chen." His assistant appeared with a tablet. "The photographer needs just 5 minutes for the official photos. Then the car will take you to the reception." The moment shattered. Alexander stepped back into his professional persona, but his eyes lingered on Isabella's face. Something had shifted between them in that chapel, something the contract hadn't accounted for. The business arrangement he'd thought he could control suddenly felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. As camera flashes popped around them, Isabella forced smiles while her mind raced. 50 days had seemed like such a specific, manageable amount of time when she'd signed the papers. Now, after one kiss and a handful of gentle words, it felt like a lifetime and an instant all at once. The locket seemed to burn against her skin, a constant reminder of the deception that would either save everything or destroy the first real chance at happiness she'd felt in years. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between protecting someone you love and being honest with someone who could matter to you? Tell us about it in the comments. The penthouse felt like a museum after midnight. All sharp edges and cold surfaces that reflected nothing but emptiness. Alexander loosened his tie as the elevator doors whispered shut behind them, the silence suddenly deafening after hours of champagne toasts and polite conversation with people who thought they were witnessing a love story. "The guest room is down the hall," he said without looking at Isabella, his voice returning to the clipped efficiency she remembered from their contract negotiation. "Third door on the right. You'll find everything you need." Isabella nodded, clutching her small overnight bag like a shield. The woman who'd whispered promises at the altar seemed to have evaporated, replaced by someone who looked fragile and out of place among the sleek furniture and abstract art that probably cost more than most people's homes. "Thank you," she murmured, then hesitated. Alexander, about what happened today, was exactly what it needed to be. He cut her off, pouring himself 3 fingers of scotch from a crystal decanter. "We gave them a show. The board will be satisfied, and you'll get your payment as agreed." Clean and simple. The words hit Isabella like a slap. She'd spent the entire reception watching him charm investors and smile for photos, but there had been moments, when he'd brought her a glass of water without being asked, when he'd steadied her during the first dance, that had felt real. Apparently, she'd been fooling herself. "Of course," she said quietly. "Just business." Alexander finally looked at her, and for a split second, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or disappointment. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "I'll be leaving early for the office. Don't feel obligated to adjust your schedule for me. We both have our own lives to live." Isabella clutched the overnight bag tighter and walked toward the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. At the guest room door she paused. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "I meant what I said in there. About these 50 days matching." The sound of crystal hitting marble told her he'd set down his glass too hard, but she didn't wait for his response. She slipped into the guest room and closed the door, leaning against it as tears she'd been holding back all day finally spilled over. The room was beautiful, all cream silk and understated luxury, but it felt like a prison. Isabella pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed the number she'd memorized. "Nana. It's me." The voice that answered was weaker than it had been that afternoon, worn thin by pain and medication. "My darling girl, how did it go?" Isabella closed her eyes, pressing her back harder against the door. "It's done. I'm married. The money will come through tomorrow, and we can start your treatment immediately." "You sound sad." Of course her grandmother would hear it. Lucia Romano had raised Isabella after her parents died, had taught her that love was the only currency that truly mattered. Now Isabella was married to a man who treated affection like a line item on a balance sheet. "I'm just tired, Nana. It's been a long day." "Isabella." The voice carried all the authority of 87 years of living. "Tell me the truth." Isabella sank onto the edge of the bed, still clutching the phone. "He's not what I expected. For a moment today I thought. But it doesn't matter. This isn't about that. It's about saving you." "Oh, my brave, foolish girl. You cannot save anyone by destroying yourself. I'm not destroying myself. I'm being practical. You are lying to a good man and breaking your own heart in the process. That is not practical. That is tragic." Isabella's hand went to the locket, feeling the familiar outline of the photograph inside. "It's only 50 days. I can do anything for 50 days." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sound of her grandmother's labored breathing. "Promise me something," Lucia finally said. "Promise me you'll remember who you are. Not who you think you have to be for money or obligation, but who you really are. That girl deserves love, Isabella. Real love." "I promise," Isabella whispered, though she wasn't sure she remembered that girl anymore. After ending the call, she sat in the silence of the expensive room, feeling more alone than she ever had in her cramped studio apartment. Through the walls, she could hear Alexander moving around, the clink of glassware, the soft sound of his footsteps on marble. Meanwhile, Alexander stood at his living room window, staring out at the city lights while his untouched scotch grew warm in his hand. The penthouse had never felt so large or so empty. He could hear Isabella's muffled voice through the walls. Another phone call, another conversation in the life he wasn't part of. The smart thing would be to forget the way she'd felt in his arms during their dance, the way her voice had cracked when she'd promised these 50 days would matter. The smart thing would be to treat this like every other transaction he'd ever made. But Alexander Chen hadn't become a billionaire by ignoring his instincts, and every instinct he had was telling him that Isabella Romano was hiding something that could change everything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his private investigator's contact. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. One phone call, and he'd know everything about the woman sleeping 20 feet away. Her real name, her real story, her real reasons for agreeing to this arrangement. Instead, he set the phone aside and finished his scotch in one burning gulp. Some walls were built for protection, and right now, both he and Isabella needed all the protection they could get. What would you do? Follow your instincts about someone even if it meant risking your emotional safety, or protect yourself by keeping your distance? Share your thoughts below. The crisis arrived at 6:47 a.m. in the form of Alexander's phone buzzing insistently against his nightstand. He'd been awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling and pretending he hadn't heard Isabella moving quietly around the kitchen, making coffee she probably assumed he wouldn't want to share. "Chen," he answered without looking at the caller ID. "Alexander, thank God." His assistant Marcus sounded uncharacteristically frazzled. "We have a situation. The Yamamoto deal." "What about it?" Alexander sat up, instantly alert. The Yamamoto acquisition had taken 18 months to negotiate, worth $200 million and crucial to Chen Industries' expansion into Asian markets. Hiroshi Yamamoto is flying in today. Unexpected. He wants to meet with you and your wife before signing. Apparently, his daughter saw the wedding photos in the society pages and convinced him that family values matter more than profit margins. Alexander closed his eyes. Of course. The one client who cared more about personal connections than bottom lines. And he wanted to meet the wife who was supposed to be temporary. How long do we have? He lands at noon. I've arranged dinner at the Four Seasons. 7 o'clock. Alexander, He specifically requested to spend time with both of you. Said he wants to see if your marriage is built on authentic foundation before entrusting his family's legacy to Chen Industries. Alexander looked toward the guest room door. Behind it was a woman he barely knew, who'd agreed to a marriage of convenience, not an Oscar-worthy performance for a client who could make or break his company's future. "I'll handle it," Alexander said and ended the call. 20 minutes later, Isabella emerged from the guest room dressed in yesterday's clothes, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked younger without makeup, more vulnerable, and Alexander felt that unwelcome tightening in his chest again. "I was going to make breakfast," she said hesitantly, "but I wasn't sure if you'd want. We have a problem." Alexander set his coffee cup down harder than necessary. "A client is flying in from Tokyo. He wants to meet us both tonight. As a couple." Isabella's face went pale. "I don't understand. Hiroshi Yamamoto values family above profit. He saw our wedding photos and wants to meet my wife before finalizing a deal worth $200 million. Alexander began pacing, his mind already working through contingencies. "We need to convince him we're authentically married. But we barely know each other. Which is why we have," he checked his watch, 11 hours to change that. Isabella sank onto the couch, looking overwhelmed. "Alexander, I can't. I'm not good at this kind of thing. Performing for people, pretending to be someone I'm not." "You won't be pretending." The words surprised them both. Alexander stopped pacing and looked at her. "Yamamoto is smart. He'll see through any act. We need to actually get to know each other." The silence stretched between them, loaded with everything they'd been avoiding since yesterday. "Okay," Isabella said finally. "What do you need to know?" Alexander studied her face, the way she held herself like she was bracing for impact, the unconscious way her hand moved to that locket she never took off. Last night, he'd almost called his investigator. Now he made a different choice. "Let's start with coffee," he said. "Real coffee. And you can tell me why you really said yes to this arrangement." Isabella's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean that nobody agrees to marry a stranger for money unless they're desperate. And despite what my cynical business associates might think, desperation doesn't usually wear Louboutin heels to contract negotiations." Despite everything, Isabella almost smiled. They were borrowed. The shoes or the desperation. This time she did smile, and Alexander felt something shift in his chest. "Both, I suppose." They spent the morning in Alexander's kitchen, a space he usually only used for reheating takeout, learning the mundane details that married couples should know. Isabella's coffee was exactly 3/4 full with a splash of cream. Alexander preferred his black and strong enough to wake the dead. She hummed unconsciously when she was thinking. He drummed his fingers against his thigh when he was processing information. "Tell me about your family," Alexander said as they sat across from each other at the marble breakfast bar. Isabella's hand went to her locket. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died. Car accident when I was 8. She's everything to me." "Is she why you're here?" The question hung in the air. Isabella met his eyes, and for a moment, Alexander thought she might tell him the truth. Instead, she looked away. Isn't family always why we do things that scare us? It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. Alexander found himself respecting the careful honesty of it. "What about you?" Isabella asked. "Why did you need a wife so badly that you'd pay a stranger to marry you?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "My grandfather's will. I have to be married to inherit his controlling shares of the company. The board made it clear that without those shares, I'm out. So we're both here because of family legacy." "Seems that way." They looked at each other across the breakfast bar. Two people trapped by love for family members they'd do anything to protect. The understanding that passed between them was wordless but profound. "We should practice," Alexander said finally. "Practice what?" "Being married." He stood and extended his hand. "Yamamoto will expect to see casual intimacy. The way couples touch without thinking about it." Isabella stared at his outstretched hand. "I don't know if I can. Just trust me." She placed her hand in his, and Alexander gently pulled her to her feet. They stood closer than they had since their wedding dance, and Isabella could smell his cologne. Something expensive and understated that made her want to lean closer. "Married couples have their own language," Alexander said, his voice softer now. "May I?" Isabella nodded, and Alexander's free hand came up to rest lightly at her waist. Not possessive, just present. "When we walk into that restaurant tonight, I need to look like a man who knows exactly how you take your coffee. You need to look like a woman who's comfortable with my touch." Isabella's breath caught as his thumb traced a small circle on her hip, barely perceptible through her sweater. "And how do we do that?" "We practice being honest with each other, even if it's just for today." They spent the afternoon learning each other's rhythms. Alexander discovered that Isabella read voraciously. Her phone was full of bookmarked articles about everything from urban farming to Renaissance art. Isabella learned that Alexander's business success masked a deep fear of being abandoned, though he never said so directly. By evening, they could finish each other's sentences and move around each other in the penthouse kitchen without colliding. When Alexander helped Isabella into her coat, another borrowed piece, though he didn't comment, his hands lingered on her shoulders for just a moment longer than necessary. "Ready?" he asked as they stood before the elevator. Isabella looked up at him. This man who'd been a stranger yesterday and somehow felt essential today. "As ready as I'll ever be." But as the elevator descended toward a performance that could make or break both their futures, neither could shake the feeling that they were about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. Have you ever had to pretend to be something you're not to protect someone you love? How did it feel to blur the lines between performance and reality? Let us know in the comments. The Four Seasons buzzed with the kind of refined energy that came with 5-star service and 7-figure deals. Alexander guided Isabella through the dining room with his hand at the small of her back, a gesture that had felt practiced that afternoon but now seemed as natural as breathing. Hiroshi Yamamoto rose from the corner table as they approached, a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. His wife, Keiko, was elegant in the way that spoke of generations of refinement, her smile warm but assessing. "Alexander-san." Yamamoto bowed slightly. And this must be your beautiful bride." "Isabella," she said, extending her hand with a grace that made Alexander proud in a way that surprised him. "It's an honor to meet you both." The dinner began smoothly. Alexander had coached Isabella on the key points of the Yamamoto deal, and she asked intelligent questions that demonstrated genuine interest. When Keiko complimented her pearl earrings, another borrowed piece, Isabella thanked her with such sincere humility that the older woman's eyes softened. "Tell us," Yamamoto said as the main course arrived, "how did you two meet?" Alexander and Isabella had practiced this story, but as Isabella began to speak, she deviated from the script they'd rehearsed. "I was having the worst day of my life," she said, her hand finding Alexander's on the table without seeming to think about it. "I'd just gotten some devastating news about someone very important to me, and I was sitting in this little cafe, crying into my coffee like a cliché." Alexander felt her fingers tighten around his. This wasn't their practice story, but her voice carried such authentic emotion that he found himself leaning in. Alexander walked in, took one look at me, and instead of avoiding the crying woman like any sensible person would, he bought 2 pieces of their chocolate cake and sat down across from me. Isabella's eyes met his. He said, "I don't know what's wrong, but chocolate cake has magical healing properties, and you look like you could use some magic." It was a beautiful story. It was also completely fictional. But the way Isabella told it, the way she looked at him as if remembering a moment that had changed everything, made Alexander's chest tighten with something dangerously close to longing. "And did it work?" Keiko asked, charmed. "The chocolate cake?" "Well," Isabella smiled, "I married him, didn't I?" Yamamoto laughed. "Delighted. A romantic. Keiko, you see. I told you this was a man who understands what truly matters." The conversation flowed easily after that, but Alexander found himself studying Isabella with new eyes. Where had that story come from? The emotion in her voice had been so real, so specific, that for a moment he'd almost believed it himself. It wasn't until they were in the car heading home that he asked, "That story about the cafe? I know it wasn't what we practiced." Isabella looked out the window at the Seattle lights streaming past. But they wanted to hear about love, not a business arrangement. "So I told them about the day I wished I'd met someone like you." The honesty in her voice stopped Alexander's breath. "Isabella, don't." She turned to face him, and in the dim light of the car, he could see tears threatening. "Please don't say anything kind right now. I can't. I'm not as strong as I pretend to be." Alexander reached for her hand instinctively, then stopped himself. They were back to being strangers again, the easy intimacy of the afternoon dissolving in the space between the back seat and whatever truth Isabella was hiding. Back in the penthouse, Isabella excused herself quickly, but not before Alexander saw her hand shake as she reached for the guest room door handle. Something was wrong. More wrong than the usual tension of their arrangement. He found himself standing outside her door 20 minutes later, listening to her muffled voice through the walls. Another phone call, but this one sounded different. Urgent. Desperate. "Can't wait another week, Dr. Martinez. Please, there has to be something." Alexander stepped closer to the door, hating himself for eavesdropping but unable to stop. I know it's experimental, but she's running out of time. The money will be there tomorrow, I swear. My husband. Isabella's voice cracked on the word. The payment clears tomorrow. We can start immediately. Silence, then a sound that made Alexander's heart clench. Isabella crying with the kind of raw desperation that came from watching someone you love slip away. Nana, please stay strong. Just a few more days, okay? The treatment will work. It has to work. Alexander backed away from the door, his mind racing. Medical bills. Experimental treatment. Someone Isabella loved was dying, and she'd married him to pay for their care. Everything clicked into place. Her trembling hands at the altar, the borrowed clothes, the way she'd looked at him like he was both salvation and damnation. She wasn't a gold digger or a fortune hunter. She was a woman trying to save someone's life. He was still processing this revelation when his phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Yamamoto wants to meet for breakfast tomorrow. He's bringing his daughter and son-in-law. Says he wants to see more of you and Isabella together before signing. Alexander stared at the phone, then at the guest room door where Isabella was probably still crying. Tomorrow they'd have to perform again. Tomorrow she'd have to pretend to be happily married while her heart was breaking with worry for someone she loved. Without thinking, he knocked softly on her door. Isabella? It's Alexander. The crying stopped abruptly. I'm fine. Just tired. Can I come in? Please. A long pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened, revealing Isabella with tear-stained cheeks and eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. I know, he said simply. Her face went white. Know what? About the medical bills. About whoever you're trying to save. Isabella's composure crumbled completely. She sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. I'm sorry. I know this complicates everything, but I couldn't. She's all I have left, and I couldn't let her. Alexander sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. Tell me. And finally Isabella did. She told him about Lucia Romano, the grandmother who'd raised her with nothing but love and pasta made from scratch. About the cancer diagnosis that had come with no insurance and no options except experimental treatment that cost more money than Isabella could make in 5 lifetimes. I tried everything, Isabella whispered, still not looking at him. Loans, fundraising, selling everything I owned. But it wasn't enough. And then your lawyer called about the contract marriage, and I thought maybe the universe was giving me one chance to save her. Alexander listened without interrupting, watching the way Isabella's hands trembled as she spoke about her grandmother's pain, her own desperation, the impossible choice between honesty and love. I know I should have told you, she finished. I know it's not fair to deceive you when you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Isabella finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but honest. Someone cold. Someone who wouldn't care if I was using him. Someone it would be easy to lie to for 50 days. And instead, I got someone who buys chocolate cake for crying strangers and helps his fake wife practice being married and makes me wish. She stopped herself. Wish what? Isabella shook her head. It doesn't matter. In 43 days, this ends, and you get your inheritance, and I get enough money to save Nana. That's what matters. Alexander studied her face in the lamplight. The exhaustion, the guilt, the love that drove her to desperate measures. He thought about the story she'd told the Yamamotos, about meeting someone who would sit with her pain and offer magic in the form of dessert. Isabella, he said carefully, what if we didn't have to pretend anymore? Her breath caught. What do you mean? I mean, what if, for the next 43 days, we tried being honest with each other? No more performances, no more pretending. Just us. I don't understand. Alexander turned to face her fully. I mean, what if I told you that I've been lying too? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew was hiding something that changed everything? How did it affect your relationship with them? Share your experience below. Isabella's composure crumbled completely. She sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. I'm sorry. I know this complicates everything, but I couldn't. She's all I have left, and I couldn't let her. Alexander sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. Tell me. And finally, Isabella did. She told him about Lucia Romano, the grandmother who'd raised her with nothing but love and pasta made from scratch. About the cancer diagnosis that had come with no insurance and no options except experimental treatment that cost more money than Isabella could make in 5 lifetimes. I tried everything, Isabella whispered, still not looking at him. Loans, fundraising, selling everything I owned. But it wasn't enough. And then your lawyer called about the contract marriage, and I thought maybe the universe was giving me one chance to save her. Alexander listened without interrupting, watching the way Isabella's hands trembled as she spoke about her grandmother's pain, her own desperation, the impossible choice between honesty and love. I know I should have told you, she finished. I know it's not fair to deceive you when you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Isabella finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but honest. Someone cold. Someone who wouldn't care if I was using him. Someone it would be easy to lie to for 50 days. And instead, I got someone who buys chocolate cake for crying strangers and helps his fake wife practice being married and makes me wish. She stopped herself. Wish what? Isabella shook her head. It doesn't matter. In 43 days, this ends, and you get your inheritance, and I get enough money to save Nana. That's what matters. Alexander studied her face in the lamplight. The exhaustion, the guilt, the love that drove her to desperate measures. He thought about the story she'd told the Yamamotos, about meeting someone who would sit with her pain and offer magic in the form of dessert. Isabella, he said carefully, what if we didn't have to pretend anymore? Her breath caught. What do you mean? I mean, what if, for the next 43 days, we tried being honest with each other? No more performances, no more pretending. Just us. I don't understand. Alexander turned to face her fully. I mean, what if I told you that I've been lying too? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew was hiding something that changed everything? How did it affect your relationship with them? Share your experience below. What do you mean you've been lying too? Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper, Her tear-stained face turned toward Alexander in the soft lamplight. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, destroying the perfect styling that had survived the evening's performance. For a man who controlled billion-dollar negotiations with surgical precision, the words felt impossibly heavy on his tongue. The inheritance clause in my grandfather's will, it's real. But it's not the whole truth. He stood and walked to the window, needing distance to find courage. My grandfather didn't just require marriage for the sake of tradition. He wrote that clause because he knew exactly who I'd become. Isabella waited, sensing that whatever Alexander was about to reveal would change everything between them. I was 12 when my mother left, Alexander said, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. She packed her bags one morning while my father was at work, kissed me goodbye, and said she couldn't live with a man who loved money more than his family. I waited by that window for 6 hours, thinking she'd come back. Isabella's heart clenched at the image. A 12-year-old boy waiting for a love that never returned. She didn't come back. Never called, never wrote. Just gone. And I decided that day that caring about people was dangerous. That business was safer. That if you never needed anyone, they couldn't destroy you by leaving. Alexander. Isabella started, but he held up a hand. My grandfather watched me build walls for 20 years. Watched me turn into exactly what drove my mother away. Someone who measured everything by profit margins, who never let anyone close enough to matter. The marriage clause wasn't about family values. Isabella. It was his last desperate attempt to force me to let someone in. Alexander turned from the window, and Isabella saw vulnerability in his eyes that made her breath catch. So when I say I've been lying, I mean I've been telling myself this was just business. That I could go 50 days keeping you at arm's length and walk away unchanged. His voice dropped to barely audible. But I can't. I look at you, and I see someone worth staying for. Someone worth the risk of being left. The silence stretched between them, loaded with confessions neither had planned to make. Isabella felt tears starting fresh, but for an entirely different reason. I don't deserve that, she whispered. Why? Because I'm still lying to you. Even now, even after what you just told me. Isabella's hand went to the locket at her throat. There's something else, something I can't. Then don't tell me. Alexander sat back down beside her, this time close enough that their knees almost touched. Not yet. Tell me something true instead. Anything true. Isabella looked at him, really looked, and saw not the intimidating businessman from their first meeting, but someone as scared and lonely as she was. Someone who'd built an empire to fill the space where love should have been. I used to want to be a teacher, she said softly. Before Nana got sick, before everything fell apart. I was finishing my graduate degree in art education. I wanted to work with kids who didn't have much, show them that creativity could be a way out, a way to imagine something better. What stopped you? Life. Bills. Reality. Isabella's smile was sad but not bitter. Hard to change the world when you're working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Alexander studied her face, seeing past the exhaustion to the dreamer underneath. What would you teach them? The kids. That art isn't about being perfect or having expensive supplies. It's about seeing beauty in ordinary things and having the courage to show others what you see. Isabella's voice grew stronger, more animated. That a sunset painted with sidewalk chalk can be just as powerful as anything hanging in a museum. Show me. What? Alexander stood and walked to his kitchen, returning with a handful of colorful pens, expensive Mont Blanc pieces he used for signing contracts. Show me. Teach me to see something beautiful. Isabella stared at the pens, then at Alexander's earnest face. You're serious. Completely. Consider it practice for tomorrow's breakfast with the Yamamoto family. Married couples share hobbies, right? Despite everything, Isabella laughed. A real laugh that lit up her whole face. You want me to teach you art with pens that probably cost more than my rent? Best supplies I have. Unless you prefer sidewalk chalk. Isabella took the pens with hands that had stopped trembling. Okay, but we need paper. And we're doing this on the floor. Art shouldn't be formal. 20 minutes later, they were sprawled on Alexander's pristine living room carpet, surrounded by papers covered in sketches and words. Isabella had convinced him to draw memories instead of objects, and Alexander found himself sketching the view from his grandfather's workshop, the one place he'd felt truly safe as a child. Tell me about this, Isabella said, studying his surprisingly skilled drawing. My grandfather built furniture by hand. Every Saturday he'd let me sit in his workshop and help, which mostly meant handing him tools and listening to his stories about coming to America with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. He sounds wonderful. He was. He's the one who taught me that money was just a tool, not a purpose. I think he'd be disappointed in who I became. Isabella reached over and touched Alexander's hand where it held the pen. I think he'd be proud that you're remembering. Their eyes met across the scattered papers, and something shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved, replaced by the kind of intimacy that came from seeing someone's soul on paper. My turn to confess something, Isabella said, her voice soft. I've never felt as safe with anyone as I do with you right now. And that terrifies me. Why? Because in 42 days, this ends. And I don't know how I'm going to walk away from the first person who's ever made me feel like I could have both love and the ability to save the people I care about. Alexander set down his pen and turned to face her fully. What if you didn't have to choose? Alexander, don't. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not making it harder. I'm making it honest. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb tracing the path of a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. Isabella, what if this doesn't have to end? It has to. You don't understand. Then help me understand. Whatever you're still hiding, whatever you think will change how I feel about you, tell me. Trust me. Isabella's hand went to her locket, and for a moment, Alexander thought she would finally reveal whatever secret she carried there. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't like their wedding kiss, performed for an audience, careful and controlled. This was desperate and honest, full of all the words they couldn't say and all the feelings they'd been fighting. Alexander's hands tangled in her hair, and Isabella pressed closer, as if she could memorize the feeling of being wanted for exactly who she was. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I'm falling in love with you," Alexander whispered against her forehead. "That wasn't part of the plan, but it's happening anyway." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling her heart break and heal simultaneously. "I know. I'm falling too. And it's going to destroy everything." "Why?" But Isabella couldn't answer, because the truth sitting in the locket against her heart would destroy the fragile, beautiful thing growing between them. So instead, she kissed him again, pouring all her love and all her goodbye into the moment. Outside, Seattle glittered in the darkness, indifferent to the two people inside who had just discovered that some contracts couldn't be negotiated. Love wrote its own terms, and the price was always higher than anyone expected to pay. Have you ever fallen in love with someone at exactly the wrong time? How do you choose between protecting your heart and taking a leap of faith? Tell us about it below. The Yamamoto breakfast was supposed to be a victory lap. Alexander woke with Isabella curled against his side on the living room carpet, their art supplies scattered around them like evidence of the night they'd finally stopped pretending. For the first time in 20 years, he'd slept without the recurring dream of watching his mother's car disappear down their driveway. Isabella stirred as morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, her eyes finding his with a sleepy smile that made his chest tighten with something that felt like coming home. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good morning, Mr. Chen." But even as she smiled, Alexander saw a shadow flicker across her expression, that same haunted look she got whenever she touched her locket. "Isabella, about last night." "Was perfect," she finished quickly, sitting up and reaching for her scattered pens. "But we should get ready. We can't keep the Yamamoto family waiting." Alexander caught her wrist gently. "We need to talk about what this means. About what happens after the contract." "After the contract, you get your inheritance and I get my payment. That's what it means." But her voice broke slightly on the words. "That's not what I want anymore." Isabella's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "It has to be what you want. It's all we can have." Before Alexander could respond, his phone buzzed against the coffee table. Yamamoto's daughter, confirming their breakfast meeting and mentioning how excited she was to meet the woman who'd captured her father's most promising business partner. An hour later, they sat in the Four Seasons sun-drenched breakfast room, performing the role of loving newlyweds for Yamamoto, his wife, his daughter Yuki, and her husband. Isabella was radiant in a borrowed cream dress, her smile perfect as she answered questions about their honeymoon plans and shared interests. "You both look so happy," Yuki said, watching as Alexander unconsciously adjusted Isabella's napkin when she reached for her water glass. "It's refreshing to see a couple so genuinely in love in a world full of arranged marriages and business deals. When you find the right person, everything else becomes background noise," Alexander said, his eyes on Isabella's face. "Father says you're an art lover." Yamamoto's wife addressed Isabella. "Perhaps you'd enjoy visiting my gallery while you're in Seattle. We're featuring a new collection of portraits, family photographs dating back to the 1940s. Isabella's hand moved instinctively to her locket, and Alexander noticed her face go pale. "That sounds wonderful. In fact," Keiko continued, pulling out her phone, "let me show you one of my favorites. It's quite touching. A young woman with her daughter, taken just before they were separated by the war. She turned her phone toward them, and Isabella's coffee cup shattered against the marble floor. The photograph on the screen showed a young woman in 1940s clothing, holding a little girl with dark curls. But it was the same photograph Alexander had glimpsed once when Isabella's locket had fallen open by accident. The same faces, the same pose, impossible but unmistakable. "I'm so sorry," Isabella said, her voice shaking as she tried to clean up the spilled coffee with her napkin. "I'm just clumsy this morning." But Alexander was staring at the phone screen, his mind racing. The woman in the photograph looked exactly like Isabella. Not similar, identical. As if Isabella had somehow traveled back in time and posed for a 1940s portrait. The resemblance is remarkable, isn't it? Keiko said, studying Isabella's face. "You could be her twin." The photograph came from an estate sale, the Rossi family, I believe. Such a tragedy. The mother died in an internment camp, and the daughter was lost to the system. Isabella stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me. I need some air." She walked quickly toward the restaurant's terrace, leaving Alexander to make awkward apologies to the Yamamoto family. By the time he found her outside, she was gripping the stone railing so tightly her knuckles were white. "Isabella, what the hell was that?" She didn't turn around. "I told you there were things you didn't know about me." "That photograph, explain it to me." "I can't." Alexander grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to face him. "The woman in that picture looked exactly like you. Exactly like you, Isabella. That's impossible unless..." "Unless what?" Her voice was challenging now, defensive. "Unless you're not who you say you are." Isabella's laugh was bitter. "Nothing about me is who I say I am." "What does that mean?" For a moment, Alexander thought she might finally tell him the truth. Instead, she pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. "Nah. It's me. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Alexander watched Isabella's face crumble as she listened to whatever her grandmother was telling her. "So it's true. Maria Rossi was my great-grandmother. The woman in the photograph." Isabella's voice was barely audible. "And you never told me because..." More silence. Then Isabella's knees gave out. Alexander caught her as she sank toward the ground, her phone clattering across the terrace stones. "Isabella, talk to me." She looked up at him with eyes full of devastation. "My real name isn't Isabella Romano. It's Isabella Rossi. Romano was my grandmother's married name, the name she took to hide from what our family had done." "What are you talking about?" "The woman in that photograph, Maria Rossi, she wasn't just some random victim of internment, Alexander. She was married to Vincent Rossi. Vincent Rossi, who stole $2 million from Chen Industries in 1943. Vincent Rossi, who disappeared with his wife and daughter when your great-grandfather tried to have him prosecuted." Alexander felt the world tilt sideways. "That's impossible. Maria died in the internment camp, but Vincent escaped with their daughter, my grandmother. She spent her whole life running from the Rossi name, from what her father had done. She married a man named Romano and tried to bury the past." Isabella's voice was hollow now, empty of everything except pain. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know until just now that Vincent Rossi was my great-grandfather, or that he'd stolen from your family." Alexander stared at her, his mind struggling to process the implications. "You're telling me that your great-grandfather stole from my company, and you accidentally married me?" "It wasn't an accident." Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. "Your lawyers found me because of the name connection. They knew exactly who I was when they offered me the contract." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. "What?" "The marriage contract was never about finding a random bride, Alexander. It was about revenge. Your board of directors knew who I was, knew what my family had done, and they thought it would be poetic justice to use Vincent Rossi's great-granddaughter to secure your inheritance." Isabella was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "They set us both up." Alexander stepped back from her as if she were poisonous. "You knew." "I didn't know about the theft until right now, but I knew they'd chosen me specifically because of my family name. I thought it was just because we were poor, because I was desperate enough to agree to anything." Isabella reached for him, but he pulled away. "Alexander, please. You knew and you said nothing. I was trying to protect you. And my grandmother and protect me." Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. "By lying to me. By letting me fall in love with the granddaughter of the man who nearly destroyed my family's company. It was 80 years ago. What Vincent did has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us." Alexander's control finally snapped. "Don't you see? This was never real, Isabella. None of it. Our marriage, our connection, everything we felt last night. It was all built on a lie designed to humiliate me." "That's not true. What we have is real. What we have is a contract based on deception and revenge." Alexander's voice turned cold, distant. "Congratulations, Isabella. Your family finally got their payback." Isabella flinched as if he'd slapped her. "You don't mean that." "I mean every word. This ends now. Today. I'll pay you what we agreed, and you can disappear back to whatever hole my board pulled you from." "Alexander, please. Don't." He held up a hand, his wedding ring catching the morning light. "Whatever you thought this was, whatever game you were playing, it's over." He walked away, leaving Isabella alone on the terrace with the ruins of everything they'd built between them scattered at her feet like broken glass. Back inside the restaurant, the Yamamoto family was politely pretending they hadn't witnessed a marriage implode in real time. Alexander apologized for the interruption, signed the contracts with hands that shook only slightly, and excused himself before anyone could ask questions he couldn't answer. Isabella remained on the terrace for another hour, staring out at the city that had promised her salvation and delivered only heartbreak. The locket at her throat felt heavier than ever, containing the photograph of a woman whose love story had been destroyed by the same forces now tearing apart her great-granddaughter's chance at happiness. Have you ever discovered something about your past that changed everything about your present? How do you separate the sins of previous generations from your own chance at love? Share your thoughts in the comments. Alexander sat in his office on the 42nd floor of Chen Tower, staring at the city below without seeing it. 3 days had passed since the breakfast with the Yamamotos. 3 days since his world had collapsed into lies and betrayal and the bitter taste of being played for a fool. The Yamamoto contracts sat signed on his desk. $200 million in new business that should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like ash. Every time he looked at his signature, he remembered Isabella's face when the truth came out, the way her voice had broken when she said his name. His phone buzzed. Marcus with another urgent matter that required his attention. Another crisis that needed his golden touch to solve. Alexander ignored it. For the first time in his career, he couldn't bring himself to care about profit margins and strategic acquisitions. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum. Isabella had packed her few belongings and left the morning after their confrontation, taking nothing but what she'd brought and leaving behind the borrowed jewelry and expensive clothes he'd bought for their performances. The only trace of her presence was the scattered art supplies on the living room floor, evidence of the night they'd let their walls down and dared to believe in something real. Alexander had thrown himself into work with desperate intensity, but even his legendary focus couldn't drown out the echo of Isabella's voice. What we have is real. Was it? Or had he been so starved for genuine connection that he'd convinced himself a woman paid to pretend could actually care about him? His computer chimed with an email from his lawyer. The contract termination papers were ready for signature. Clean, efficient, absolving both parties of further obligation. All he had to do was sign, and Isabella Romano, Isabella Rossi, would disappear from his life forever. He reached for his pen, then stopped. Something had been bothering him since that morning on the terrace, something beyond the shock of her deception. He pulled up the background report his legal team had compiled on Isabella before offering her the contract, reading it for the first time with clear eyes. The inconsistencies were glaring once he knew what to look for. Her employment history was too clean. Her references too perfect. Someone had scrubbed her background, made her look like exactly what she claimed to be, a desperate woman in need of fast money. Alexander picked up his phone and dialed. Morrison Investigations. Jack, it's Alexander Chen. I need you to run a background check and I need it deep. Deeper than whatever my legal team did. What am I looking for? The truth. About a woman named Isabella Rossi, formerly Romano. And I want to know who knew what when my lawyers first approached her. How deep we talking? All the way to the bottom. While he waited for answers, Alexander found himself walking to the guest room where Isabella had stayed. The space had been cleaned and reset to pristine emptiness, but he could still catch traces of her perfume in the air, something light and floral that had nothing to do with the expensive fragrances he usually associated with women in his world. On the nightstand, his housekeeping staff had left something behind. A small piece of paper covered in Isabella's handwriting. Alexander picked it up, recognizing it as one of their art exercises from that last night together. What does love look like to you? He'd asked, and she'd written her answer in careful script. Love looks like someone staying when they find out you're broken. Love looks like choosing to see the best in someone even when they can't see it in themselves. Love looks like a man who teaches a crying stranger that chocolate cake can be magic. Alexander sank onto the bed, the paper trembling in his hands. Even then, she'd been trying to tell him something true. Even in the middle of her deception, she'd been more honest than he was ready to hear. His phone rang. Jack Morrison's gravelly voice filled the silence. "You sitting down, Alex? What did you find?" "Your girl's clean. Cleaner than clean. Isabella Romano, and it is Romano, by the way, legally changed from Rossi when she was 18, has never had so much as a parking ticket. Works 3 jobs, sends every spare penny to her grandmother's medical care, volunteers at a women's shelter on weekends." Alexander felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. What about the connection to Vincent Rossi? That's where it gets interesting. Vincent Rossi did steal from Chen Industries in 1943, but here's what your legal team conveniently left out of their report. He gave the money back. What? Found the records buried in your company's archives. Vincent Rossi returned every stolen dollar 6 months after he took it, along with a letter apologizing and explaining he'd only taken it to pay for his wife's medical treatment. Your great-grandfather accepted the repayment and agreed not to press charges. Alexander's world tilted again, but in the opposite direction. Then why? Because 3 of your current board members, Hendricks, Walsh, and Torres, are descendants of men who lost out on promotions when your great-grandfather chose to forgive Rossi instead of making an example of him. They've been carrying that grudge for 3 generations, waiting for a chance to settle the score. They orchestrated this, down to the last detail. They found Isabella through the medical bills connected to her grandmother's care, researched her background until they found the Rossi connection, then made sure your lawyers approached her specifically. They wanted you to fall for her and then discover the truth in the most humiliating way possible. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his own stupidity crash over him. How long have you known this? Just figured it out. But Alex, that girl had no idea about any of it until that morning with the Yamamotos. I've got phone records showing her grandmother finally told her the truth about Vincent Rossi in real time. She was as blindsided as you were. Alexander ended the call and sat in the silence of the room where Isabella had cried herself to sleep, trying to save someone she loved while falling for someone she couldn't have. She'd been as much a victim of the board's manipulation as he had, maybe more so because she'd actually developed real feelings in the process. "What we have is real," she'd said, and he'd thrown it back in her face. He thought about the woman who'd volunteered at shelters while working 3 jobs, who'd married a stranger to save her grandmother's life, who tried to teach him that art was about seeing beauty in ordinary things. The woman who'd kissed him like she was drowning and he was air. Isabella wasn't the enemy. She was just another casualty in a war he hadn't even known was being fought. Alexander stood and walked to his desk, where the contract termination papers waited for his signature. He picked up his pen, then set it down and reached for his phone instead. Meanwhile, Isabella sat beside her grandmother's hospital bed, holding a hand that felt more fragile each day. The experimental treatment was working, slowly, but working, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic. The money from the marriage contract had accomplished exactly what Isabella had hoped. So why did she feel like her heart had been carved out with a spoon? "You look terrible, my darling girl," Lucia whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "I'm fine, Nana. Just tired." "You are grieving." Isabella tried to smile. "I'm relieved. The treatment is working and soon you'll be well enough to come home." "And what about your husband?" The word sent a spike of pain through Isabella's chest. He was never really my husband. It was just business. Lucia's knowing eyes studied her granddaughter's face. Is that why you cry in your sleep? Because of business. Isabella looked away. She'd been staying in a small hotel near the hospital, spending every day at Lucia's bedside and every night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment with Alexander and wondering how something so beautiful could have turned so poisonous. I hurt him, Nana. I lied to him, and when he found out the truth, I hurt him. Did you mean to hurt him? No. But that doesn't matter. The damage is done. Lucia squeezed Isabella's hand with surprising strength. Tell me about this man you didn't mean to hurt. And despite herself, Isabella found the words pouring out. She told her grandmother about Alexander's walls and his wounded eyes, about the way he'd taught her to see that wealth could be a tool for good, about the night he'd learned to draw memories and she'd learned what it felt like to be cherished. He sounds like a good man, Lucia said when Isabella finished. He is. Which makes what I did to him even worse. What you did or what was done to both of you. Isabella looked up sharply. What do you mean? Lucia's expression was sad but not surprised. My dear child, do you really think it was coincidence that they found you? That out of all the desperate women in Seattle, they chose Vincent Rossi's great-granddaughter? The truth hit Isabella like a physical blow. You think they knew. About Vincent, about our family. I think there are people in this world who carry hatred like a poison, passing it down through generations until they forget what they're really angry about. And I think you and your young man were caught in the crossfire of someone else's old war. Isabella stared at her grandmother, pieces clicking into place. If that's true, then we were both victims. Both of us were manipulated. Perhaps. But that doesn't change how you feel about him, does it? Isabella's eyes filled with tears. No. It makes it worse, because now I know he was right to never trust anyone. And I know I'll never get the chance to show him that some people are worth the risk. Lucia was quiet for a long moment, then smiled with the kind of wisdom that came from 87 years of loving and losing and choosing to love again anyway. My brave girl, let me tell you something I learned when your grandfather died. Regret is heavier than fear. If you let this man walk away without fighting for what you found together, you'll carry that weight for the rest of your life. But he hates me now. He thinks I'm just another person who betrayed him. Then prove him wrong. Isabella's phone buzzed against the bedside table. A text from an unknown number that made her heart stop. Can we talk? I know the truth now. All of it. She stared at the message, her hands shaking. Through the hospital room window, Seattle stretched out in all directions. A city full of second chances and impossible possibilities. What would you do, Nana? Lucia smiled. I'd remember that love is the only magic that's real, and I'd go fight for it. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your pride and fighting for love? What made you decide which path to take? Share your story with us below. Isabella found Alexander where she'd expected to, standing in the corner of Lucia's hospital room, looking uncertain and out of place among the sterile medical equipment. He held a massive bouquet of sunflowers and wore jeans instead of his usual armor of expensive suits, making him look younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "You came," she whispered from the doorway. Alexander turned, and Isabella's breath caught at the raw emotion in his eyes. "I should have come sooner. I should have." He stopped, his gaze moving to the small figure in the hospital bed. "Is this her? Your grandmother?" "No, this is Alexander." Isabella stepped into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Alexander, meet Lucia Romano, the woman who's worth everything to me." Lucia studied Alexander with the sharp eyes of someone who'd lived long enough to see through pretense. "So you're the man who's been making my granddaughter cry." "No," Isabella said, mortified. But Alexander stepped closer to the bed, setting the sunflowers on the nightstand. "I'm the man who was too proud and too scared to see the truth when it was right in front of me. I'm sorry for hurting her. I'm sorry for not trusting what we had." Lucia's expression softened. "And what did you have?" Alexander looked at Isabella, and she saw everything in his eyes. Forgiveness, hope, and something that looked remarkably like the love she'd thought she'd destroyed. "Something real," he said simply. "Something worth fighting for." "Then sit down, young man, and let's talk about how you're going to win her back." For the next hour, Isabella watched in amazement as her grandmother charmed the most powerful businessman in Seattle into sharing stories about his childhood, his fears, and his dreams for a future he'd never dared imagine. Alexander listened with equal fascination as Lucia told him about raising Isabella, about immigrating with nothing but hope, about building a life from love and determination. "She gets her strength from you," Alexander told Lucia, his eyes on Isabella. "Her courage, her willingness to sacrifice everything for the people she loves." "And where do you think she gets her stubborn streak?" Lucia asked with a wicked smile. Alexander laughed, a real laugh that made Isabella's heart ache with how much she'd missed that sound. "I was hoping that was just a character flaw I could work with." "Oh, you'll be working with it for the rest of your life if you're smart enough to marry her properly this time." Isabella felt her cheeks burn. "Na. What? I'm old, not dead. And I didn't raise you to settle for contract marriages when you could have the real thing." Alexander stood and moved to where Isabella sat, extending his hand. "Can we take a walk? There's something I need to say, and I need to say it right." Isabella looked at her grandmother, who shooed them away with a gentle wave. They walked in silence to the hospital's rooftop garden, Seattle spreading out below them in the afternoon light. Alexander led her to a bench overlooking the city, then turned to face her with an expression that was both nervous and determined. "I know the truth now," he began. "About Vincent Rossi, about my board's manipulation, about how we were both pawns in someone else's revenge plot. I know you didn't choose to deceive me. We were both set up." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Alexander, I'm so sorry. I should have told you about the family name connection, even when I didn't understand what it meant. I should have trusted you." "No," Alexander said firmly. "I should have trusted you. I should have seen that everything about you, your kindness, your courage, the way you lit up when you talked about teaching, none of that was an act. I let my fear of being abandoned make me abandon the best thing that ever happened to me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, but he didn't open it. Instead, he set it on the bench between them. "Isabella, I've spent my whole life believing that love was a transaction, that people only stayed as long as the terms were favorable. But you taught me something different. You taught me that real love isn't about contracts or guarantees. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's scary, even when it's imperfect." Isabella stared at the box, her heart racing. "Alexander, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to tear up our contract and write new vows. I'm saying I want to marry you again, not for money or inheritance or family pressure, but because I can't imagine a life without your terrible morning hair and your tendency to hum when you're thinking and the way you see magic in ordinary things." He picked up the box and dropped to one knee on the hospital rooftop, looking up at her with eyes that held no walls, no defenses, just pure, terrifying love. "Isabella Romana Rossi, teacher and dreamer and the strongest woman I have ever known. Will you marry me? Not for 50 days, not for anyone else's approval, but forever, because you're my home and my adventure and my reason to believe in magic." Isabella looked down at him. This man who'd learned to draw memories and fight for love, and felt the last of her walls crumble. Alexander Chen, stubborn billionaire and secret romantic, and the man who taught me that chocolate cake can indeed be magical. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. For real this time, for love, for always. Alexander stood and kissed her as he slipped the ring onto her finger. A simple solitaire that caught the afternoon light like captured starlight. This kiss was different from all the others. Not desperate or performative, but celebrating. It tasted like promises kept and futures written in hope instead of fear. When they broke apart, Isabella looked down at her hand and laughed through her tears. "So what happens now? Do we plan another wedding?" "Actually," Alexander said, pulling out his phone, "I was hoping we could take care of that right now." Isabella stared as a small group emerged from the rooftop access door. The hospital chaplain, Marcus with a tablet and a huge grin, and Lucia in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse, wearing the biggest smile Isabella had ever seen. "You planned this," Isabella said, half laughing, half crying. "Your grandmother planned it. I just provided the logistics." Alexander took her hands. "Isabella, we've had enough performances for other people. This time, I want witnesses who actually care about us." The second wedding of Alexander Chen and Isabella Romano was nothing like the first. There were no expensive flowers or designer gowns, no photographers or society pages coverage. Just two people who'd found their way back to each other, surrounded by the few people who mattered most. When the chaplain asked if they had vows, Isabella looked at Alexander and smiled. "I promise to trust you with my broken pieces and help you heal yours," she said. "I promise to see the magic in ordinary days and the extraordinary in ordinary moments. I promise to choose you not just today, but every day, especially on the days when love is a verb instead of a feeling." Alexander's voice was thick with emotion as he responded. "I promise to let you in, even when it scares me, especially when it scares me. I promise to remember that the best investments aren't measured in dollars but in moments, in kindness, in the courage to love someone completely. I promise to be the man you saw in me before I saw it myself." As they kissed to seal their new beginning, Seattle glittered below them like a city full of possibilities. Lucia wiped away happy tears while Marcus discreetly filmed the whole thing for the wedding album they'd actually want to keep. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the art classroom of Roosevelt Elementary School, watching Isabella teach a group of 8-year-olds how to paint sunsets with watercolors and dreams. She was radiant in paint-splattered jeans and a Chen Industries t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, completely in her element. "Mr. Chen," one of the students called out, "look what I painted. It's you and Mrs. Chen on your wedding day." Alexander studied the child's artwork. 2 stick figures surrounded by sunshine and hearts, holding hands under a rainbow that took up half the paper. "It's perfect," he said, meaning it. "Absolutely perfect." That evening, they sat on their penthouse balcony, redecorated now with comfortable furniture and Isabella's art supplies scattered everywhere, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "Any regrets?" Alexander asked, his arm around Isabella as she leaned against his chest. Isabella thought about the question seriously. "About the contract marriage that brought us together? No. About almost letting fear keep us apart? Every day. Even though my board members are still trying to make our lives difficult?" Isabella smiled. After the truth about the manipulation came out, Alexander had systematically removed Hendricks, Walsh, and Torres from the board, replacing them with people who valued innovation over ancient grudges. It had been a business bloodbath, but a necessary one. Especially because of that. They thought they were destroying us, but they actually gave us the greatest gift imaginable. They showed us that love is stronger than revenge, that choosing each other is the only victory that matters. Alexander pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Mrs. Chen. The real Mrs. Chen. I love you too, Mr. Chen. My husband, my home, my happily ever after." As the Seattle skyline settled into evening, 2 people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances settled into the rest of their lives together. The contract that had brought them together was framed in Alexander's office now, not as a reminder of deception, but as proof that sometimes the universe conspired to bring 2 people together, even when they thought they were too broken to deserve happiness. Love, they'd discovered, didn't require perfect timing or flawless circumstances. It just required 2 people brave enough to choose each other again and again, until choosing became as natural as breathing. And in the end, that choice made all the difference.